Okay, in stage 3, then we move to processing. So we went from planning and direction to the collection being the most expensive, and now we're going to this makes sense, right? We're going to process the information that we've collected, right? So in stage 3, we're talking about processing. Stage 3. Stage 3, we talk about processing. So data collection must be converted into usable and comprehensible information, right? The data that's being collected has to be converted, right? So that this idea that we have, as we said before, is we have raw information. We have raw information that's gathered. That raw information that we get needs to be converted, right? We need to be able to code for the information that we have. And I'm sure they have, I hope they have a system in place. I don't know this, but, and I'm sure they do. They have a system in place for coding, right? There's, within qualitative methods analysis, there's a way for coding for information. And there's different types of coding that you can use based on data that you've gathered. But there really should be a means of coding for information. To be honest with you, now that I think about it, I could do a 15-20 hour lecture series on how that could be accomplished, right? How you could code for data, especially if we're talking about, the data that we're coding for or making sense of in terms of tech is rather obvious, right? In terms of signals intelligence is rather obvious, right? There are ways of interpreting scientifically that data, right? So that the apparatus that's used to interpret more technology-based data is scientific, right? The apparatus is science. The apparatus for interpreting and coding for processing human intelligence, however, I would imagine is pretty sketchy, right? And there really should be a rather, I don't know that there is, and again, I don't mean this just for the United States, I mean this for any, intelligence community anywhere. The manner in which information is coded for with respect to humans' intelligence is important, right? So there has to be a way in which this information is processed. It's not just that we're looking for, name dropping, even though that might be important. Do you know this particular person in an interrogation? Or if it's an act of seduction and there's information that's being divulged, not knowing that the seducer is an operative, the idea is, it's not that I'm just waiting for information in terms of someone dropping a name, but there should be a repository of everything said, and everything said should be individually coded for, right? And then you can create algorithms that run programs to sort of match things that people have said. Theoretically complex, but this structure can actually be done, right? There's a means of doing this, right? So that the processing phase is really important. I would imagine that processing technical information gathered in the collection phase is easier because science becomes the apparatus with which that information is interpreted. With respect to human intelligence, science can't be the way that that information is interpreted, and I would imagine that the quality could be affected then, right? So if there is this tension between the old world model and the new world model, the human int versus more technologically based intelligence collection, it might be the case that coding specifically as process, coding for human intelligence isn't as refined as it might need to be in order to properly get quality information from the stuff that's said, right? Because it's all conversation for the most part. All right, so data collection must be converted into usable and comprehensible information. One of the biggest factors in processing is the amount of information that floods in for processing. Oversaturation, as I said many times, of information. Quote, the vast amount of information gathered by America's intelligence agencies is never examined. The fate of an estimated 90% of what the intelligence community collects. 90% of the stuff that comes in can't even be analyzed because it's an oversaturation of information. I can't even imagine how that's been compounded by the internet, There's a tremendous amount of information out there. It's for all practical purposes infinite. There's a tremendous amount of information that's out there. What I'm going to do in the next section is to then sort of cross-reference that fact that 90%, this is a direct quote, that 90% of the information that comes in can't really be used, coupled with the fact that 95% of the information that finds its way into the intelligence briefing is itself, as was said, since 95% of the intelligence that is gathered from open source information, right? 95% that comes in that actually is going to be processed and is going to find its way finally into the intelligence briefing. Not to say that the intelligence briefing is all open source information, that's obviously false. But that this huge amount of influence is going to be placed on open source information gathering. 95% of the intelligence that is gathered from OSINT. And since 90% of the intelligence cannot be processed, the vast majority of unprocessed information must be open source intelligence. It has to follow. And it also makes sense, right? There's going to be tremendous amount of influx of information, oversaturation of information coming in from open source information, but the vast amount of that information isn't going to be processed. It can't be. It's just too much of it, right? Which has to lead to the question on the viability of open source. Now, that's a different, and I don't want to go too deep into that. I mean, I always am cognizant of the fact that I'm giving this, I forgot to start my clock. I'm always cognizant of the fact that I'm giving this lecture publicly. So I always sort of give a more introductory account, even if it's a graduate level, an introductory account. So there's some things that I'm just not going to discuss publicly. I definitely will write on this in a formal publication later, and I will address this specific point more rigorously. But even then, there's things that I won't discuss. The idea is simply this. The nature of the viability of open source information, if we recognize that, and I mean specifically now aspects of open source. So open source as a set, and you might address collection of information from social media as one source, collection of information from YouTube as another source, and so on. Since we recognize that 95% of the information that's coming in, the overwhelming amount of information that's coming in is open source, but that most of that information isn't being used, the idea is, if it's the case, and I want to make sure that this is clear, if it's the case that so much of that information is disposed of, since it's the case that so much open source information is disposed of, and I don't know these statistics, but they should be known internally within any respective intelligence community, how much manpower, how much womanpower, how much time is being spent attempting to process that information by actual people. You can have machines can do this, right? But how much time is being spent by actual people processing that information? Why? It wouldn't make logical sense to attribute a lot of human expenditure, human capital. It wouldn't make sense to use a tremendous amount of human effort to process open source information in mass, because it is a complete waste if the facts are that 90% of that information is not going to be used, or is, for all practical theoretical purposes, going to trash. But a significant 20-30% of what is being processed by actual people is open source information. It's a waste of manpower, right? Systemically, it's a waste of manpower, right? The oversaturation of open source information then would obligate human labor in terms of processing information that will never find its way into the final deliverable. And if that's the case, then a tremendous amount of what's being done is being wasted in terms of manpower. So that if I were to go in, for example, consulting, it would be always an indication of the efficiency of the processing phase is absolutely important, right? If there's any weakness, it's not so much the planning and directive phase. It's obviously not the collection phase, right? But how information is processed is going to be important, because most of this information processing is going to have to find its way through humans in some sense, right? And even if machines do a lot of the processing, scientifically making sense of what means what, you have to have people who have expert training that understand